press the live button and my mic immediately goes to mute. So, hello everyone. This is what the pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with the amateur exegete, otherwise known as Ben. We are going to be talking about the discussion with Daniel McClellan, Wes Huff, where Daniel McClellan responded to Wes. Wes did some interesting things and made some interesting comments on undesigned coincidences. I'm not going to talk too much about that specific today, but Eric Manning of Testify, he responded to Dan and basically tried to critique Dan's arguments, give some additional arguments for undesigned coincidences. And I think that there's some things that Dan says that could be worth commenting on, maybe a little iffy, maybe some good arguments, as well as Eric, who makes also some good arguments, but also could be worth commenting on. We're just trying to get some new views out and help people understand the topic better. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm in my great Greek costume, which
you look very handsome, and I can't tell that you're wearing any kind of bald cap or anything like it's just seamless up here, just seamless.
Yeah. I've had multiple people say, like, "Is that your real hair?" I'm like,
yeah.
What?
Who did your makeup? Who did your makeup? Was that professional or?
Well, it's a secret.
All right, I understand.
Yeah. So, anyways, so of course, undesigned coincidences, really short, basic version. Essentially, maybe like a real world example. Suppose that we see someone get a return at a store, okay, and they say, "Hey, I was shipped a basketball and I ordered makeup," and then another person says, "Hey, I ordered a basketball and I got makeup," or makeup and a basketball, whatever. And you might be thinking, well, just one of them by themselves, it's like, well, that happens. Maybe someone shipped it out, but hey, maybe they're lying. Maybe they lied about, and they just want to get another thing of makeup. Who knows? But if two people come along and it just happens like that, their stories fit together like a puzzle piece, it seems obvious that these types of people, these two people, they just got shipped the wrong things. They got switched around, and that's actually something that happened to my friend. But that's just a really basic version, and a lot of Christians, and I guess basically only Christians, they will use it to argue for the trustworthiness, the historicity of the Gospels and some other biblical texts. And even though I am a Christian, I think it's very important that people understand the topic as good as they can and are aware of all videos, all opinions that maybe don't make things as so obvious. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So did you have any thoughts before you wanted to begin, Ben?
No, just to say that in principle, undesigned coincidences are, they almost seem kind of obvious that would happen in the real world, right? And when Lydia McGrew talks about that, she just emphasizes the fact that they are undesigned things that coincide. Like, there's nothing novel about it, really. There's nothing fantastic about it. It's actually a pretty ordinary argument or a feature of the real world. And it works best, like you said, when you kind of have independent parties that are, that these things they see and things they say coincide together. But the emphasis is on independence, and that'll come into play, I'm sure, as we get along here.
Awesome. And your mic's being a little weird. Can you try testing it out? Just speak.
Yeah. Can you hear me good?
No, leave it plugged in there.
No.
I'm going to try something with StreamYard. Now talk.
All right. Hello.
Yep. All right. Sounds good right now. So that might have been like the StreamYard application. All right. So anyways, Yep. Let's get going here. Let's get started. We'll just let Eric just go right into it. And of course, and this is not Christian approved.
Deadpool?
Yeah, this came out of nowhere.
This is the 1,400 hours a year you waste on your phone. With Purdue Global, you can turn that time into a degree. These are flexible,
Oh wow.
Man, you can't even
high-value
skip it.
degrees that fit your goals and schedule.
This is a great
Visit
stream so far.
purdueglobal.edu to find out.
Everybody,
We're getting free
share what your
advertising.
favorite.
Come back.
Exactly.
Hey everybody, so recently Dan McClellan has made 3 response videos to Wes Huff on undesigned coincidences. And if you've been following my channel for any length of time, you know that I'm a big fan of using undesigned coincidences as an argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels. Dan, on the other hand, thinks that this is just Wes fumbling the bag. He doesn't understand scholarship. He doesn't understand how the Gospels were put together. And there just really are no undesigned coincidences. They could easily be explained away. So for those of you who are new here, I'm going to just kind of back up a little bit for a second and explain what undesigned coincidences are. Basically, they're notable connections between 2 or more accounts or texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the person or people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the items fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So one gospel will raise a question in passing, and then another will give the missing detail in passing in a very subtle, casual, and undesigned, artless looking way. I believe this is a strong sign of eyewitness testimony and historical truth. Dan, on the other hand, has a theory that can pretty much explain away any undesigned coincidence. Let's hear from Dan.
The biggest weakness of this idea, and one that I'm going to keep coming back to, is that this only demonstrates that there's a pre-existing source to 2 different versions of a narrative. It does not demonstrate that the pre-existing source is actual events in history that the people who created the narratives both witnessed. So it could be an oral tradition. Oral traditions famously have lots and lots of details, and a lot of times people will draw one detail from the oral tradition for one telling, and somebody else will draw another detail, and those could interlock in a way that indicates they're both basing their story on a pre-existing narrative. Or it could be literary. There could be a literary source for a story, and somebody could draw one detail from that literary source, and another person telling a different version of the story could draw a different detail from that source. So we always have oral tradition and literary tradition that can be behind the existence of these undesigned coincidences.
All right, so I agree with a lot of what Dan has said here, but I do think that maybe Dan is a little unclear on some things, and I think that might be affecting Eric's response later. Not that it's Eric's fault, but Dan's in a lot of off-the-cuff type of situations. He's not reading from a script, so sometimes he's not the clearest. So what Dan says is, this only demonstrates that there's a pre-existing source to 2 different versions of a narrative. It does not demonstrate that the pre-existing source is actual events in history that the people who created the narratives both witnessed. So I actually disagree with Dan here, at least with the way he words things here, because Dan's claim seemed to imply that genuine undesigned coincidences can only get you to one source, as if nothing else is possible. But I don't think that's correct, and I don't think he even means that. He seems to say contradictory things later. I think Dan would say it can still allow for multiple sources. It's just difficult to narrow any of it down. So maybe a better way to put it, to be more helpful for the audience, is even if you grant that a case is a genuine undesigned coincidence, meaning there isn't some, Luke using Mark, and that's why it looks like an undesigned coincidence, but really the writer knew about it, or maybe there was some parallel to Psalms, not something like that. But if you can rule those out hypothetically, which Dan doesn't think you could do anyways, but hypothetically, even if you can grant that a case is a genuine undesigned coincidence, that fact alone never licenses confidence that reflects eyewitness knowledge rather than one or more prior oral or literary sources. They indicate dependence on something prior, but they don't tell us exactly what the prior source is. Did you have any thoughts on that, or what he said so far?
No, yeah, that's exactly right, because you can't go from you're trying to interrogate what your source is, but the unfortunate thing about doing ancient history is you don't always know. You don't always have access to it unless you're assuming what you're arguing for, right? So if you're assuming this is an eyewitness source, then you're going to go straight to the eyewitness source. But what evidence do you have specifically for that? And that's why when Dan talks about texts, like everyone thinks it has to be one single thing, but I think he's just kind of using shorthand, like scholarly shorthand, for just the entire stream of oral and written tradition. And I think later when but when Eric critiques him, Eric, rightly or wrongly, but understandably, is critiquing what Dan McClellan has said, even though I think Dan McClellan means something a little bit different than what Eric is taking him to mean. That text does not mean a single source, but it's just kind of a term for all the sources. But I could be misrepresenting what McClellan is saying. I don't want to do that, but that's the sense I get. When I read about text, I think, well, it's the pool of tradition, oral or written. But I think Dan's right, that just because you have interlocking details doesn't mean you've gotten to history. Maybe you did. You got to do a little bit more work.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's also a lot of misconceptions here, because obviously he does think that there's other ways to resolve these things. So first, that it's not just everything is this or source, and that's the most likely explanation. I don't even know if he thinks there's ever a situation where the source is the most likely thing. Obviously he thinks that John used Mark, and before we get into all this topic, that's probably a good way to thing to mention. So could you talk about the dependence in the Gospels? Many Christians probably aren't even aware of this. So obviously Mark was written first, or maybe not obviously, but there's lots of scholarly arguments for reasons for that, and pretty much, or most scholars agree that Mark wrote first. Could you talk about what happened after that? Did Luke know about Mark? Did John know about Mark?
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a few competing theories, hypotheses about the dependence of the Gospels. Mark is generally taken to be the first one written, but who wrote next? So if you take the two source hypothesis, for example, it's usually going to be Matthew and then Luke. Both use Mark, and then they both use Q, which is a probably written source of sayings of Jesus. If you take the Farrer hypothesis, then you have Matthew using Mark, and then Luke using Matthew and Mark. And this is, of course, popularized by scholars like Mark Goodacre, who's written the book on these topics, but also like Eric Eve, and I think Barbara Shellard has written a book on this, or not a whole book, but a section of her book, New Light on Luke, talks about this. I'm trying to think who else, but usually it's Mark, then Matthew, then Luke. And then you have a growing number of scholars who are basically taking the position that was once the position of the earliest, like the church fathers, or some of them, that John also was a reader of the synoptic gospels. So that, that's the probably, at least that Mark is the first, is the scholarly consensus today. But yeah.
And this is really important, because if there is some type of undesigned coincidence, but someone like John or Matthew knows about Mark, and they just happen to match up in details like a puzzle piece, but if Matthew obviously knew Mark, then that seems like that would be extremely easy, highly probable explanation for such a thing, right? So anytime you mention something and you rely on somehow them not knowing each other, but if John and Mark are fitting like puzzle pieces, you almost have to say, okay, that is a huge reason to be skeptical on this one, or at least cautious, because it's really difficult to know if you're just, thinking that it's just a puzzle piece because you think it's eyewitness testimony, or because they just knew each other, right?
Yeah,
Obviously,
yeah, it should make you ask the question, well, at the very least, did John read Mark? Did he
Yeah.
know his gospel? That's at the very minimum. That should be your first question.
Yeah. So now we get into that. Let's keep going here.
So since Dan says that this is the biggest weakness to undesigned coincidences and something he's always going to go back to, that's what I'm going to focus in on this video. The thing about this is proponents of undesigned coincidences, we've heard this argument before from Richard Carrier, of all people. Now, that's not to say Tricky Dicky can't be right, broken clocks and all that, jazz, but this is how Carrier summarizes it. But even such a theory as that only gets you to a source, not that source being true, the source that they are all redacting differently could simply be an gospel, just as late and fictional as its many subsequent redactions. Rather than an actual event witnesses remember differently, it could simply be a master story authors are copying from differently. Now, what's interesting about this is that Lydia McGrew in 2017, and then she republished it on her own blog. She published this in a previous blog post, and I'll link both in the description below. She responded to this whole idea way back then. So that's 8 years ago. And she said that since the argument from undesigned coincidences has been so neglected, there isn't scholarly literature out there responding to it. And I hesitate to make any strong predictions as to whether or not some type of source or text theory, this is what Dan's proposing, will prove to be popular among scholars who are dubious about the argument. My bet right now is that at most it will be used in some isolated cases rather than being used widely. But I could be wrong, and New Testament scholars are very good at waving hands and at an unspecified source as an explanation for everything, so maybe the temptation to do so here will prove too strong. I'm going to predict that mainstream New Testament scholars will not explicitly postulate a single ginormous source containing everything, all coincidences, both sides, and other contents of the Gospels, etc., because that would be too obviously in conflict with popular theories of origins of the Gospels, such as the two-source hypothesis. If they use such a type of response at all, I'm guessing they will content themselves with vaguely hypothesizing some earlier source for some selected coincidences. So Lydia is basically a prophet here, and Dan is just falling right in line with the prediction of Lydia's there. Now, what exactly is wrong with the textual source? I'm going to be using a lot of Lydia's information here and just kind of sharing it on a popular level. But again, check out the blog posts. They're in the description below. Lydia points out we have no manuscript evidence of any sort of textual sources. We also have no quotations from any early church fathers. And so all this really does is just add an unnecessary layer between our documents and the real events. This is really just an ad hoc rescue, and it violates Occam's razor. It's more complex. It's just more simple to say that we have what we have, right? Than to add this unnecessary source for which we have no evidence at all. Now, let's see how this plays out.
I know you have a lot of thoughts there. What do you think?
Oh, okay. So I don't even know where to begin. First of all, the hypocrisy of lambasting New Testament scholars for relying on scholarship when Manning is more than willing to depend on McGrew and what she has to say, right? So he may say, well, I don't read the scholarship or whatever, or we line up behind scholars. He does too. He does the same thing. He just has his preferred group of people. But either way.
Just for clarity, what was that in response to? What did he say specifically that made you say that?
Well, no, what triggered it was I've had interactions with Eric before. Not many have been fruitful, and that probably is mostly my fault. But there's this tendency for the McGrew crew to look disdainfully or they just don't appreciate, or they don't see why anyone would appreciate New Testament scholarship, right? But they're doing their own thing with their own scholarship. I mean, it just strikes me as kind of hypocritical. But his comments there on, I'm using Lydia McGrew stuff just kind of triggered that memory and just interactions I've had and whatnot.
Mhm.
And he does appeal to scholarship. And if you read his blog posts quite often, he did a blog post on the deaths of Judas Iscariot, where he quoted I. Howard Marshall in his commentary on Acts for the Tyndale New Testament series, which, by the way, he did not give you the full context, but that's neither here nor there. But he does quote scholars. He just has his preferred scholars, and I think we would do well to just acknowledge that and not look down on each other just because we use scholars that line up with our views, or we either way. Another issue that I have is that let me see if I can find it, because he said where is it? I have it written down, and I thought it was just really oh yeah, okay. So one of the things that Eric says about what McGrew, how she responds to sources, is that she claims, well, we don't have any extant examples, right? We don't have any sources. We don't have any eyewitness testimonies either, unless you are assuming that the Gospels are eyewitness sources. But then you're using undesigned coincidences to prove that they're eyewitness. You're just running in circles, right? So there's kind of a tautology going on here, where she says, well, we don't have any sources, but we do have eyewitness testimonies, and see, here are these undesigned coincidences, and this proves their eyewitness testimony. Well, no, you're assuming. You're just running in circles on this.
And just for some clarity there, so someone might say, hey, well, obviously we're not going to see eyewitness testimony because, like, we don't have a video recorder. All we have is what is written down. But what you're saying is that we don't have any other texts that could be that. I mean, why not just say the Gospels are eyewitness testimony in that case? I mean, it's not like we would expect to see other eyewitness testimony that this is eyewitness testimonies based off. Like, that wouldn't make any sense. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. What I'm thinking is that unless you're going to build the case first that they're eyewitness testimony, then using undesigned coincidences seems almost like question begging, right? Like, why should we think that's the case? Because then again, like you said earlier, now what if we have a literary reason for thinking these things interlocked? How would you demonstrate that this is not literary, that it is eyewitness? How would you interrogate the text? What methodology would you use to do that? I don't think the McGrews have done that work. I don't think they've taken the steps to prove that, to at least not to my satisfaction, which, I mean, who am I, right? So, but so either way, I have a problem with that. I also have a problem with the idea that just because the church fathers don't quote it, that it must not have happened. I don't really understand that argument. Like, there's a lot we don't have, right? Like, and a lot of the stuff that we do know about, like when it comes to, like, for example, non-proto-Orthodox Christians, like Valentinius and Marcion, and I mean, you could rattle them off. Most of what we do have is in response, right? It's polemic against them. So we're already getting it filtered through people that are against, like they're anti that view.
Sure.
So I don't see why appealing to the church fathers necessarily does any really heavy work for an anti-source argument. And we know from reading the church fathers that they were still steeped in oral and written, right? It's Papias who talks about the value of, like, oral, the spoken word, even as he's textualizing traditions in his five volume series. So it's not as if there aren't numerous oral sources circulating that must have had other traditions about Jesus, right? But how do we know if those were eyewitness? Like if they came from eyewitnesses? These are second century, right? So um, I don't feel the weight that she does for appealing to the church fathers to say this couldn't have been this way. It just doesn't appeal to me at all. But
Yeah, no, you're right. So pretty much every Old Testament text we have, there's a really good chance it's related to oral tradition. Basically, all of the Dead Sea Scrolls have some kind of oral tradition base, Homeric tradition, pre-Talmudic rabbinic ideas, pre-Pauline creeds, the Q document. Obviously, I mean, the interesting thing about this is, and obviously they're very dismissive of Q, but so many scholars present what a lot of Christian scholars, like well-educated Christian, God-believing, supposedly, and Holy Spirit Christians, they believe in a Q source. So, maybe those are like, oh yeah, that's just scholarly academia poisoning their mind, right? But it's like there's this idea is like, oh well, we don't have a specific source, so it's so likely that it doesn't exist. But on this very topic, there's just so many good reasons to think, hey, there was certainly oral tradition. There's a really high chance that there was some type of other written tradition. So yeah, I don't see that either. And you're right about the early church fathers. There's just so many texts that we do not have. It's just an extremely small percent. We've lost almost every text out there in history. So an early church father not mentioning it, even though they actually do mention oral sources that you mentioned, it doesn't really give us that much information. Like maybe it raises the probability just a little bit for their argument, but I don't even know if it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, well,
did you have any other thoughts there?
For example, to go back to Papias, virtually everything we have from Papias, and Papias was a bishop in Smyrna around the end of the first century into the second. We have nothing by him, no extant writings. There is no manuscript of Papias. What we do have are quotations from Papias that are scattered throughout later writers. For example, Eusebius. So anytime anybody says, well, like the tradition about Peter being the source behind Mark. Well, Papias is probably the root of that tradition. At least that's the argument. Michael Koch makes that argument in his book, The Gospel on the Margins, which is about the reception of the Gospel of Mark in the 2nd century. And he thinks Papias, all the traditions about Peter being the source can be rooted and found in Papias. But what we have from Papias on this comes from Eusebius, which is 200-300 years later. That's the earliest extant evidence we have of Papias. Papias wrote a 5-volume work that at least that's what we're told, and none of it exists in any form save for select quotations in a few church fathers. And to the point that the early church fathers were using both textual and oral traditions, Apollinarius, when he quotes Papias, but he knows the tradition of Matthew and Luke, that Judas Iscariot hangs himself, but then he says he couldn't have died because Luke says, he falls headlong in a field, and then he quotes Papias, his other source. He has 2 gospel sources. He has Matthew and Luke Acts, but then he has another tradition, likely began in some oral tradition, of Judas Iscariot, swelling up and talks about his genitals becoming grotesque and huge, and and that's how he dies, right? So there's all these sources that are circulating in the earliest Christian movements, and if these are the ones we know about, what do we not know about? Like what else was invented, or maybe went back all the way? Like, what do we know? How do we interrogate this? How do we figure this out? And that's just one of the issues I have with this view that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, is that how do you go back and figure that out specifically? Instead of, like McGrew says, this Ur source creates a extra layer. And an unnecessary layer. I think eyewitness testimony does that, at least for
Yeah.
Mark and Matthew, right? I mean, Luke says he goes back and talks to people, and he obviously has written sources. He says so, and so does the Gospel of John.
Yep.
But Mark and Matthew don't. Like, they don't say we're eyewitnesses. They don't intimate, like, there's no sign of that. I mean, there's some like Richard Walkham argues, like for Mark, that, like, for example, the presence of Peter at the beginning and the end is a way to indicate eyewitness testimony, or at least that it's rooted in Peter. That's debatable. Like, it's not, I don't think many scholars are convinced by that argument. But for me, why add that unnecessary layer of eyewitness testimony? At least for Mark. Like, at least for Mark, you know? So I think that argument can be, flung right back at the McGrew crew.
Right. Yeah. So eyewitness actually, it assumes a lot. It's not some simple view. There is, like, when we're talking about our history today, there is to give you to like get something with high confidence, you got to have a lot of information other than like some kind of video reporting. And this is in a time when everybody speaks like a historian, essentially. I mean, you got your normal Facebook stuff where people are making stuff up, but at the same time, like, it's a very literal, like, nobody's writing news reports and poetry, right? And this is a time period where this idea of history is just in the very origins, all kinds of people making stuff up. Eyewitness testimony, it requires direct access, controlled transmission, stable preservation across decades. If you want to say it's reliable, it requires generally accurate memory, which is a huge problem to any psychologist out there. This is all in a culture where all of this is, virtually non-existent in writings. I shouldn't say. Well, I guess yeah. Actually, I would say that there are obviously certain eyewitness testimonies out there, but it's very few.
Well, like, for example, Herodotus is writing a history of, like, the Greeks and like the relationship between the budding Greek culture and previous and surrounding cultures. But he will, first of all, he uses the first person to indicate he's an eyewitness for stuff. He claims, at least, to have traveled to see certain things. Like, he goes to Egypt and he, there's some bizarre claims he makes, but he's an eyewitness as he's doing this history, but he's not an eyewitness for all the history. Or Polybius, who writes his histories about the conflicts between Carthage and Rome. In book 5, he says at the beginning, he says, for all this previous material, I've relied on, I forget the author's name. But then he says, right now I'm going to talk about stuff that I'm here for, like, that I know. That's an eyewitness, right? That's somebody who's in the know. Where is that in Mark or Matthew? Like, where is that eyewitness testimony? It's not there. Like, it's not there. And I just, they weren't historians anyways, right? They were Greco-Roman biographers, and that's a kind of a different animal. It's like history adjacent. But that had its own conventions, and it had its own tropes, and it could be very fictional. It had its own rhetorical purposes. And the Gospels fit right into that. But that then raises the question of what's genuine history and what's invention or extrapolation or scripturalized narrative or things like that. Ancient history is so complicated. You know what I mean? Like you said, like, modern history, you're right. We want citations for stuff. Like, give me a footnote to a source. Give me a photograph. Give me a video. We don't have that for Jesus at all,
Yeah, not really even close to it. At least that's noticeable. Maybe we have a video reporting out there. It's like a little script, subtitles. But how would we know is the question, right? So and I don't think literary tradition is that crazy. So maybe we don't know a specific text. It exists, a physical text. Obviously, oral tradition existed. People talk. That's just human nature, right? Yeah. And the question is, can you prove it? No, right? That's probably not something you can prove. but there, I haven't seen any strong reason to reject it for most things, at least. Now, so is it how complicated is it? I mean, literary tradition, oral tradition, it requires one remembered association. You're in a limited tradition stream. Everybody doesn't have to believe it, as we'll talk about later, and it has to be preserved because it fits existing narrative structures. So maybe we'll get into that a little later. But any other thoughts before we keep going?
No. Let's.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. This is going to be a 5-hour video, so I can't wait. And I mean that if we go at this pace. That's okay.
Example in the Gospels. This is one that Dan interacts with in his second video, and it's the woes on Bethsaida and Chorazin. So in Matthew 11:21, Jesus denounces Chorazin and Bethsaida for rejecting his miracles, but Matthew never tells us what exactly those miracles were. And so the reader is just kind of left puzzled and asking, why is Jesus being so mean to Bethsaida? Now, Luke casually notes that the feeding of the 5,000 took place at Bethsaida, while Matthew leaves out the location entirely. Luke doesn't tie this to Jesus' later denunciation. He just drops the setting and the woes in chapter 10 in passing. Matthew arranges thematically. He puts the woe in chapter 11 and the feeding in chapter 14 with no location attached. And so what we have here is that there's this missing puzzle piece that gets filled in. Luke supplies the missing setting, while Matthew and Luke preserve the actual saying. Furthermore, there is a blind man at Bethsaida in Mark 8:22 through.
All right. I know you have some thoughts there. What do you think?
Oh, again, where
saying.
to, like, where do I don't even know how to start this, because so the central question, for at least for Eric, is why is Jesus being so mean to Bethsaida? Now, note that he's not asking why is Jesus being so mean to Bethsaida and Chorazin, or why is Jesus being so mean to Bethsaida, Chorazin, and Capernaum, right? Like, the text in Matthew doesn't just say, woe to you, Bethsaida. It doesn't even begin with Bethsaida. It begins with Chorazin. So it's almost like Eric is fishing. He's fishing for something to kind of like tie it in to prove his case, but he's ignoring all these other details that don't suit his case. And kind of this selective, this it just reeks as kind of this arbitrary, picking and choosing to prove the undesigned coincidences. But even in the examples that he gives, so first of all, Matthew does explain the woes, right? So in Matthew chapter 11, verse 20, then he, that's Jesus, this is from the NRSV updated edition, then he began to reproach the cities in which most of its deeds of power had been done, because they did not repent. There's the reason for the woes. We don't need any other explanation from Matthew. We don't need any examples. We have the reason. Those cities did not repent. Therefore, the woes. So we've taken care of that. So that's taken care of. Luke notes that the feeding of the 5,000 happens in Bethsaida. He does this at the expense of his own narrative, right? Because Bethsaida is a city and not a deserted place. It's a place where they can get food.
Right.
Moreover, he does it in contradiction to the Gospel of Mark, which places the Bethsaida somewhere else than, the feeding of the 5,000. It's not in Bethsaida, it's somewhere else, right? And Matthew, too, seems to imply, by the narrative logic, that the feeding of the 5,000 could not have happened in Bethsaida. It happened somewhere between Capernaum and what's the name of the city? I can't think about it off the top of my head. But either way, so Matthew doesn't have it that way. Mark certainly doesn't have it that way. So, but Luke has this detail. But here's the problem, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, yes. Luke supplies a miracle, right? That gives us Matthew's location. It still doesn't explain the woe, right? Just because a miracle happened there, where's the narration about them not repenting? Where's the reaction to the miracle? We don't. That doesn't exist. Like, Matthew never intimates at all that in the feeding of the 5,000 that they rejected him. In fact, is it Matthew who has? Was it Matthew chapter? Oh, what is it? 14. I'm trying to think. I got my Bible out right here. Yeah, Matthew he doesn't say anything about their reaction. Just that they were filled. Like, they ate their full, and he says nothing about they didn't repent or they cursed him or whatever. So that doesn't explain the woe at all. Like, on at least on Eric's reasoning. Neither does it do that in Luke. When Luke gives the woes, and when he tells the story of the feeding of 5,000, that's not what happens either. There's no evidence that they reject him outright. So, I mean, he's trying to offer this explanation for the woe, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't. All he's done is shown, in theory, that it happened in Bethsaida. He doesn't show that there is a reaction by the people to justify the woe. Like, there's nothing in there. But Matthew does. But Matthew's not interested in saying it happened in Bethsaida. He's just saying they didn't repent. Like, but his feeding doesn't happen in Bethsaida. Like, it just doesn't, you know. So I find that really, like, he doesn't quite get there. Like, Eric's not quite to the point where he can demonstrate that there's a reaction. Like, if you're going to say we have a reason for it, but your reason doesn't include that the reaction of the crowd that justifies the woe, have you really demonstrated the undesigned coincidence? I don't think you have. I think you got to go a few more steps, and maybe Eric can do that work. That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting point. So I don't mean any of this to say that undesigned coincidences are impossible or anything like that. If there are better arguments given, I would love to see it, especially in peer review. So I would love to see a really good scholarly argument in peer review, and then some scholars respond to it, see how that goes, and see that. I mean, that's really how you see if an argument's worth taking. So yeah, I would love that. So maybe people can respond and say, hey, you missed this, Zach, you missed this, Ben, and then we can learn. So you did make a really good point there that it doesn't seem like Eric addresses, which is that it seems like some of these events happen in a deserted place, and then I believe it's Luke who comes along and says, hey, yeah, it's at Bethsaida. It's like, are we what's going on here, right? And then obviously that's a really big problem, at least in my opinion, at least for trustworthiness. And I mean, you've talked about a lot of this in your videos and stuff you've talked about, is that if there's a contradiction, sure, like some eyewitness testimony is contradictory, right? But at the same time, that I think it has a big problem, at least for reliability, for if you want to construct it from a historical standpoint. And it's not like, oh, well, you know, these undesigned coincidences are just so obvious that it just doesn't matter if there's a contradiction, right? Because I think there's plenty of plausible ways, even if there wasn't a contradiction, but there being a contradiction, I think, makes it even more of a problem. And I think that it definitely should be addressed. And pretty much any time you talk about at least this specific one, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, yeah, I think so. I think when it comes to contradictions, it could very well be that Luke's got it right. Mm-hmm. But for that to be the case, then you would have to say Mark's got it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think for somebody who holds to a view like inerrancy adjacent, because the McGrews, as far as I know, neither Eric nor the McGrews hold to inerrancy as it's typically understood, at least is how I grew up believing it, right? They believe something close to it, but not quite. And if I'm misrepresenting them, please correct me. But they still believe in the general reliability of all the Gospels, like, because they're maximalists, right? They want to use all the data to demonstrate their point. But if you say, well, Luke gets it right, then that means somebody got it wrong, and that's just unacceptable. But I'm not opposed to the idea that Luke did get it right. I think, like you said, it raises some serious narrative issues, given its location in the story and how very clearly, he's lifting this from a previous written source. Like, if you're an eyewitness testimony, why do you have to rely on somebody else? Why not use your own sources? Which, but yeah, I think that it does undermine reliability, especially for the overall
Are you talking about
case.
Mark or Luke?
Well, primarily for both, really.
Yeah.
Only because for Luke, he's obviously depending on a source. At least on at least on Mark and priority, right? If you assume he used Mark, which I think is correct, I think there's reasons to think that, then that raises an issue. Luke could have it right in some of the details. Maybe he's saying, yeah, I got this from Luke, but I got this from Mark, and I'm making some corrections. But then that also makes you wonder, well, then what's his eyewitness here? And doesn't that make Mark wrong? And if Mark is based on Peter's teaching, would that make Peter wrong? Like, I think there's a lot of thorny issues involved if you were to acknowledge a problem with Luke's account, or Mark's account, excuse me. But yeah, I forgot where I was going with that. But yeah.
Well, and just for clarity, so Dan takes some good amount of time in I think it's his second video, to talk about the contradiction. And if you can check that out if you want to learn more about that contradiction explained a little bit better. So, all right, let's keep going.
Furthermore, there is a blind man at Bethsaida in Mark 8:22 through 26 that is healed by Jesus in two stages. You guys probably remember that he sees men walking around like trees, and then Jesus ministers to him again. He's healed. You get some other odd details besides that. Jesus actually leads him out of the town first. Then after the healing, Jesus says, don't even enter the village. Mark never explains why this healing had to happen outside of Bethsaida and why he tells him, like, hey, don't even go back. The whole instruction feels really weird, really puzzling, right? But if you put these things together with the woes in Matthew and in Luke, Jesus would have probably here already pronounced the woe on Bethsaida for rejecting his miracles. Now, neither Matthew nor Luke include the blind man's story, and Mark includes the healing, but he omits the woes. So when you put them all together, Jesus' actions in Mark make perfect sense in the light of the judgment already recorded by Matthew and Luke. So there's actually a bonus undesigned coincidence here. Now,
what do you think about this one?
Yeah, so first of all, the elephant in the room. Why do neither Matthew nor Luke include this story? Right? Like, it's a pretty interesting story. I think it's probably one of the more interesting miracles. If for only that, the only reason I say that is because it's a very like a physical story. It makes Jesus seem even more hands-on. But why would Matthew and Luke choose to admit it? Well, maybe because they tend to not want to have stories about Jesus where the miracles don't work out right away. Right? I think... Or is this the right... Am I got the wrong one? Let me see. I may be thinking of a different miracle. Oh, no, Matthew. Mark 8. Mark 8. They don't have this miracle story. So, Matthew and Luke could have easily put this in, and it would have fit perfectly in their narratives, save for the fact that they tend to take out material that makes Jesus look like he's not as, efficacious as they like to portray him. But also, why is it odd? Why does Eric think that it's strange that Jesus leads them out of the city? I don't understand why that's odd. Like, maybe it's odd to him, but to me, Jesus likes to take people aside, or remove them from a situation to do either a teaching or a miracle or whatever. And he'd already done this before. I think it was a deaf man. Let me see if I have my notes on this. In chapter 7, in Mark chapter 7, he takes a deaf man, and the people bring him to him, but Jesus takes him aside privately to do the miracle, like out of sight, right? So it doesn't seem odd to me that Jesus would take this blind man and lead him outside of the city to perform this miracle. It kind of fits with his theme of not necessarily a secrecy motif, but just the idea of going into a more private or secluded area to perform his miracle. Because you got to remember, Jesus in Mark doesn't want everybody know. He doesn't want the crowds, right? At this point, he's kind of not anti-crowd, but he's worried about popularity. And again, that kind of plays into the secrecy motif. But another issue is there's also in Mark, there's this theme, right, of the new Exodus. The beginning of Mark kind of sets the tone with this quotation from Isaiah. It's really a composite quotation. But he quotes it from Deutero-Isaiah. And the whole Deutero-Isaiah is all about a new Exodus for the people of God. And Mark is setting his gospel up and staging his gospel for this new Exodus for God's people. And what does God do in the Exodus? He leads Israel out. I think it's the prophet Jeremiah where he takes them by the hand and leads them out. And I think Mark is playing into this. I think that's part of his motif. It's kind of running through the narrative. Now, Eric, of course, is going to say, that's just, scholarship run amok, or hermeneutical pareidolia. I think that's what he calls it later. But the Gospels weren't written in a vacuum, right? They're not some new thing. If they were, no one could read them. And I think people who heard the Gospel of Mark, especially if they were Jews, would have picked up on some of this language or the ideas. He wasn't writing for a modern audience. He was writing for an ancient one. And they would definitely pick up on this. And if Eric, for some reason, doesn't think that's the case, he's made that case before. He talks about when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's obviously a quotation from Psalm 22. And he's talked about how it's not a cry of despair. It's he's quoting it because the ending of the psalm is positive, and then readers of Mark would have gotten that. Well, you just made my case about this, right? We're saying very similar things. It's just that you want to make it for Psalm 22, and I just want to make it because Mark has a very obvious New Exodus motif. So I think we have to appreciate the fact that Mark was a reader of the Jewish scriptures, and he knew how to work with them. He knew how to use them. And it kind of makes you appreciate Mark all the more. At least it does for me.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting in how they use the text, and kind of makes it beautiful in that kind of way. So let's keep chugging.
Well, if we take Dan's Earth source theory for a test drive here, we could just we would have to say that there was a single prior source that already contained everything: the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida, the feeding of the 5,000 in Bethsaida, the woes pronounced on Bethsaida. Then this is what the gospel authors allegedly did with this. Mark keeps only the blind man's healing, but he drops the feeding location and omits the woes. Luke mentions the feeding location, but never connects it to the woes and omits the blind man entirely. Matthew includes the woes, removes the feeding location, omits the blind man, and rearranges the material. Does this really make a whole lot of sense?
You have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah. So why do we expect? So first of all, I can see where Eric is kind of. I can understand his feelings about this source. Because if you're really going to say everything comes from this single source, it does feel like hand waving, like a just so story. You know, my son's been reading in school the Rudyard Kipling just so stories. You know, why the rhinoceros has tough skin, or why the giraffe has a long neck, and stuff like that. And you know, they're fun little stories, but no one believes them. So these kind of, I can understand where Eric's coming from. It kind of does seem that Dan, by alluding to or appealing to this, alluding to this source, kind of feels like hand waving. I can understand that. On the other hand, so does appealing to eyewitness testimony, because it's the same kind of thing. He just waves his hand and see, oh, it's eyewitness testimony. It's eyewitness testimony. You got to do more work than that. It's going to take a little bit more work to get there. But, you know, let's see. I had some notes on this section from Eric.
You might be commenting on something a little bit later, so Eric says all of this about Dan's views, but he doesn't actually address really any of Dan's arguments here, and there's a lot of other parts of the video that he doesn't really address. So I don't know if you actually saw the videos, Ben, but I'm just like, I don't know, just a little confused. It's like, you know, why respond if you're not going to actually address his arguments? You know, maybe he wants to focus on this Earth source, but obviously Dan's views are not only on the Earth source, and it's just a very small part of it, even if he does emphasize it. Yeah, like Dan talked about like 10 minutes on this topic, and he didn't really say anything, anything about it. I'll read it real quick. So Dan's original video, Matthew's account, is using Mark as a source, and Mark quite explicitly in chapter 8 has Jesus healing a blind man explicitly in Bethsaida. So Matthew is likely referring to what is explicitly said in Mark 8. Luke comes later. Luke comes after Matthew. So Matthew does not have the benefit of Luke's reference to Bethsaida. So it's not that Luke is the only way to make sense of the statement about the miracles performed in Bethsaida, but there's more. This gives us reason for Luke's insertion of Bethsaida into the narrative, creating this incongruity that we have seen between them being in the city of Bethsaida and them being in a deserted place surrounded by unnamed villages. Luke was probably trying to account for what he found in Matthew. Matthew says all these miracles were performed in Bethsaida. I don't really have any miracles to talk about in Bethsaida. Why don't I just place this one that I'm taking from Mark and Matthew in Bethsaida? And it causes this narrative incongruity. So, yeah, I mean, Eric doesn't say anything about that, and I think that would be helpful if he would have addressed it. But
but I don't know if I buy Dan's explanation either. Like that, I don't know. That doesn't sit well with me. I don't think we'll ever know why Luke threw in Bethsaida. I just don't think that. Mark Goodacre has a footnote on this in his paper on editorial fatigue, and he cites a couple scholars that tried to give an answer, but he just thinks that there's no way. There's no real good answer. And I can't think of any commentary I've read that really gives any kind of, or even ventures really, to explain why Bethsaida. I don't think Luke read Mark and needed a miracle. Maybe that's the case. It would be interesting to see if Dan has any sources, like any scholarship on that, that I'm not aware of, because it'd be nice to have an explanation. You know what I mean? Because it's such a weird thing for Luke to do. But then Luke is somebody who, you know, invents a census at the birth of Jesus. You know, he's sometimes not a great reader of Josephus. If you accept he knew Josephus. So I don't know. Maybe he just.
Yeah, it's not the strongest argument. At the same time, for how much reading I've done of people in ancient history, they do the craziest things, in my opinion. You get some of the silliest stuff, so nothing surprises me in any way at all.
Yeah.
So as I said before, not the strongest argument in my opinion. He might say it a little bit too confidently, but I don't know. I'd like to hear his thoughts there. All right. So then we have 7. Yep. Okay. Let's keep going.
to you. It doesn't to me. Think about it. This requires authors who are constantly discarding context they already possess, fragmenting a coherent narrative for no apparent reason, and doing so in different ways that just happen to interlock later. If you're copying from a source that explicitly said the woes were pronounced because of the miracle, the natural move would be to copy both the fact and the causal link. Copyists usually would tend to preserve explanations, but we know that eyewitness testimony just doesn't work that way. It seems more probable that when people experience real life events, they often recall isolated details without spelling out the causal connection and don't remember it clearly enough to mention it at all. And so it just seems more probable this is based on eyewitness testimony. Now, what's interesting is in his second video, Dan does.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, so the gospel authors were not copyists, right? They're not. They're authors. They're readers and they're authors. And Eric wants to apply the standards of a copyist onto the gospel authors, and that is just not the way. It does not map onto them at all. And what he says that this requires authors who are constantly discarding context they already possess, because they do. Luke takes, so in the Gospel of Mark, the rejection at Nazareth is a pivotal part in Mark chapter 6, because what it does is you have the rejection at Nazareth, and then you have the mission of the 12. It's Jesus saying, I'm not going to my hometown because a prophet is, not accepted anywhere. Like what he says, let me quote it. He says, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin in their house. So when they reject him, when they reject his message, Jesus immediately goes about anywhere else. So it opens up this whole thing in Mark, a whole new section. Luke takes that scene and fronts it to just after the whole thing with Jesus' baptism and whatnot. He takes this narrative, and now it has a whole different function for him. He's added material. He has Jesus reading, which is surprising. Like he's reading from Isaiah. And the whole point is we're going to the Gentiles, because that's a theme for Luke. Luke is all about the Gentile mission. But he does that because he's moved it from its original context in Mark, something Eric says doesn't happen, and he puts it in the front. So Luke already does this. He adds material. He changes locations. This is something that authors did. They all did it. It's just astounding to me that you could read the Gospel of Luke, as Eric has doubtless done numerous times, and not see this affronting of the episode, that Luke is willing to move things around. Or take Matthew's version of in the Passion narrative. In Mark, Jesus, he goes out, then he comes back, he curses the fig tree. Like it's this whole thing. He goes to the temple and casts out the money changers. Matthew changes the whole narrative, so it changes the meaning of it. It's kind of frustrating because one of my frequent critiques of this maximalist approach is that because they are fishing for details to make the case for eyewitness testimony, they're missing the narrative itself. Like they're not reading the Gospels as the Gospels are. They want to create something entirely. I think Bart Ehrman talks about this. Like they're trying to create their own fifth gospel, right? They're picking what parts they want and then making their own. Why not just read them as they are and understand the narrative as they've written it? The problem with the maximalist approach, this eyewitness testimony approach, is that they're bad readers. They're very poor readers of the Gospels. It's just very frustrating, and you see this even in like Lydia McGrew's books, like her latest one, Testimonies of the Truth. She just ignores details and essentially argues, I think implicitly argues, against their reliability, like undermining her own argument. I don't know. It's just really, really frustrating to say,
Yeah.
they're not copyists, they're authors.
You also made a good point in your notes that I'm stealing from you, that Josephus adds in author's details in his retelling of Jewish history. So supposedly he's a
Yes.
historian, right? But that dude is like, he is the biggest, just like making up stuff and just hyperbole because he's trying to make, Judaism look great. And he has no problem changing things. He says the craziest thing. He says something like, our manuscripts or our, scripture is all one text, right? And it's like, have you met the Dead Sea Scroll guys? Right? Like, what?
Yeah.
What? Like, clearly, there's no way that he didn't know that. There's just no way that he didn't know that there was multiple versions of a text. Is the wildest thing. Yep. And then let's see here. In your notes, you also, which I'm also stealing. So copyists may do what Eric's saying, but authors are free to do as they please. Evangelists were not setting out to just preserve tradition, but to use it, and that means they weren't copyists.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Let's keep running.
Out the causal connection and don't remember it clearly enough to mention it at all. And so it just seems more probable this is based on eyewitness testimony. Now, what's interesting is in his second video, Dan does try to take the divide and conquer approach. And he claims that Matthew invented the woes by reflecting on Mark's account of the blind man's healing. And then he also claims that Luke invented the same woes by reflecting on the feeding of the 5,000.
What do you think?
Well, so again, if that's Dan's theory, I mean, I do have reservations about it, and I can understand Eric's trepidation. It makes perfect sense to me. But so let's see. I got my notes in front of me.
I have a question for you. You didn't really have much to say here, but what do you think Luke is doing if you don't agree with McClellan there?
Well, is Dan still talking about Bethsaida?
So Dan specifically says, Luke was probably trying to account for what he found in Matthew. Matthew says all these miracles were performed in Bethsaida. I don't really have any miracles to talk about in Bethsaida. Why don't I just place this one that I'm taking from Mark and Matthew and Bethsaida? So I don't know. I think he was a little ambiguous, to be honest. I think Eric might be misreading him, but it's also possible that it's true. But yeah, so he says that Matthew invented the woes by reflecting on Mark's account of the blind man's healing. This is what Eric's saying. And then he also claims that Luke invented the same woes by reflecting on the feeding of the 5,000. So do you have any idea why Luke seems to include these woes, but do it in a context of something about feeding of the 5,000?
Yeah, I see. I don't know. The woes, pronouncing prophetic judgment is a Jewish pastime. You find it in the prophets. So casting Jesus as this old-timey prophet fits well. One of the things that I'm a firm believer, although I could probably be convinced otherwise, that Luke is writing apologetic historiography. That's what Luke Acts is all about. And so Luke is trying to show that the earliest, that the Christ-following communities trace their origins all the way back, like to Jesus, and it goes even farther back. And in the eyes of the Romans, to whom Luke is in part writing and he's interacting with, and the antiquity is an important thing. If your religion is old, that's good. And so Philo does this with Moses, and so he may be the woes may be a nod to that. It could also be, and I'll concede this, it could also be from Jesus originally. I mean, maybe it is. I don't think it is, but it very well could be. But maybe that's why, why doesn't Jesus, why are there no scenes with Chorazin? Why does it, we have Bethsaida, but why do we have no information in Luke about Chorazin? That's tied to the woe. So maybe it was a kind of like a free-floating oracle that Jesus pronounced that Matthew and Luke either picked up from Q, because that's only a double tradition text, or Luke got it from Matthew. If you're on the Pharaoh hypothesis, like that's his source. But I just don't. I don't know. I don't have any strong opinions. Of course, all that talking I just did maybe betrays that I don't have any strong opinions.
You said a lot of maybes. I'll give you a pass.
Thank you. I try to couch my, hedge my bets.
Right. It's difficult.
But if the woes are literary inventions derived from the miracle stories, then we would expect the causal link to be explicit. An author inventing material on the basis of another story would naturally say why Bethsaida is being judged. Instead, both Matthew and Luke present the woes without explaining the cause.
I know you got stuff to say about this one.
Well, Matthew does explain the cause, right? Matthew explains why he's doing this. Again, this is why I go back. Maximalists like McGrew, like Eric, tend to be poor readers of the Gospels. Matthew has a reason for the woes. The cities did not repent. He says that. He doesn't need to give any other explanation. He doesn't need to give you specific examples. It's sufficient for Matthew, as Matthew, to say, the cities did not repent, therefore the woes. And something I'm thinking about right here, are the woes an end to themselves? Because, like, immediately after in Matthew 11, so this is Matthew 11:25. So he's given the woes, right? He's telling them that it's going to be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for you in the judgment. Then he says in Matthew 11:25, at that time Jesus said, at that time, there's a temporal marker. He's given the woes. Now he's going to say something else. I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. Right? The whole point of the woes isn't just to do the woes, it's to make a contrast between outsiders and insiders. Those who believe and repent, which is Jesus' message, right? And those who do not. So there's a rhetorical, polemical angle to this that I think Eric is missing. He's focusing on the woes because he needs it for his undesigned coincidence. But in doing so, he's not reading the passage. Like he's just picking details. He's not reading the passage and trying to discern what is Matthew doing here. I mean, the Gospels become a means to an end for him, and not the end in themselves. And I think that's a bad reading, a bad way to approach them. Read them in their context, and at least for Matthew gives a reason. Now Luke, I'm not sure really why Luke does it. I don't know why. I think he's using Matthew. He might be using Q. I'm not a big believer in Q. But even so, he's pulled it from a text. He's pulling it in. That's enough. That's enough for me. It doesn't raise any questions. I don't have the same inclinations, I guess, as Eric does. Maybe we just come to this from such different perspectives that I can't even sympathize with that. His reading inclinations. It's just not the way I read a text, especially an ancient text like this.
Right. So yeah, when I think of this, I think that inclusion is usually, not always, but usually motivated by theological or rhetorical relevance. If he's going to say that we would expect there to be a causal link explicitly mentioned, that I don't think that's the case, because I don't think it would continue his narrative, at least. Now maybe someone could prove me wrong, right? But it's a general rule that these people in ancient times, they're not just writing 21st century historical accounts, right? They're not just including things just for the detail. They usually have purposes to it. There's some outliers, but yeah.
Well, exactly. That's exactly right. Does Eric think that Matthew was writing this gospel and didn't know what the heck he was doing? Does he think he's incompetent? He doesn't have any kind of narrative goals, or like, even if you believe the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, even if you think that they are rooted in somebody who was there, the evangelist chose the medium of narrative to communicate. And they necessarily had to pick and choose what to include and what to exclude, unless you think everything that's in the Gospels is everything Jesus did. And that very act of choosing, that very act of picking and choosing what you're going to include and how you're going to place it, is very informative. Because it tells us that these are not people who are simply communicating like the exact details and truth. They have very specific rhetorical aims. It's not just you record somebody on videotape who just witnessed a car accident. That's not what this is. This is people writing after the fact, and they're reflecting on what they've seen and what they've heard on the assumption of eyewitness testimony. So even if you assume it's eyewitness testimony, you still have to deal with the fact that they chose a specific literary form available to them in the first century of the Greco-Roman world. I think I think to me it's very instructive.
And what's really weird about Dan's theory is he hypothesizes that basically Mark had the story about the blind man who's taken out of the town and told not to go back into the town is the basis of why Jesus said that if the miracles worked in Bethsaida were something that that Tyre and Sidon had seen, they would have repented a long time ago. And so wait, like the guy doesn't even return. So how does that even make sense?
I don't know if you had much to add here, but I just say real quick that the miracle can still be associated with Bethsaida, and I think that almost certainly it would. It explicitly says they came to Bethsaida. So even if it's right outside, if you are reading this text, you're going to associate it with that text, even if it's technically not in the exact same place. The hailing begins in Bethsaida. It involves townspeople and is clearly Bethsaida associated tradition.
Yeah.
Anyway, what makes more sense is that this is just based on independent eyewitness testimony and all these pieces fit together. So the biggest problem that Lydia points out, and I think this is probably her strongest point, is that if you apply the source hypothesis of Alter and Dan echoing it here, you can basically erase any historical event on eyewitness testimony that you want. Anytime that sources interlock, you could just invent a lost source, say all the surviving accounts, just copy fragments from it, and then declare the source may or may not be true. And now, congrats, you can just basically doubt any event in history. You could just doubt it, right? And this ends up.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about this and probably mean some stupid, but I do think this was really interesting comment, because there is, at least in some cases, and maybe a lot of cases, I don't know, I can't read Dan's mind, that there could be some just internal biased, unconscious assumption that, hey, maybe there is some prior source and we can just assume that, and that's going to be more likely than a eyewitness testimony. Maybe I could see that being totally possible. I can't read his mind, but I do think that anybody, you can doubt history all you want. The question is if there is evidence for it, or if there is evidence against it being a prior oral source, and then evidence for or against eyewitness testimony. So sources or interlocking isn't enough to establish that it is eyewitness testimony. You need a lot more than that. And I do want to comment on the framing of what he says here. So he says you could just invent a lost source, but obviously nobody's inventing anything, as if an original physical or oral source for two similar documents has never existed before, and Dan is just inventing an idea that has never happened in ancient history. Obviously, oral or original sources are routinely lost. There are tons and tons and tons of texts that we don't have today, and that there are tons and tons of texts that are talked about by other ancient writers, and we don't have access to those. But that's just physical copies that are mentioned. There were obviously tons of other Christian texts that just haven't survived. There was almost an infinite amount of oral stories because that's just what humans do. And Eric's acts like not having a physical copy of something means it's highly unlikely that one could ever exist, but that's just not true. So no, scholars aren't inventing sources. They're looking at all the possible options and asking where the evidence leads. There are tons of different possibilities which could explain what we see. Oral source, written source, multiple oral sources, multiple written sources, and others. None of these have to be eyewitness testimony. And it is Eric and whoever else's job to show that these are very unlikely, each one, not just one, and that means it just doesn't exist, right? That's another problem with a lot of these conversations. It's like anytime you have 17 different possibilities on the table, lots of people, and this is just a human thing, not specifically Eric, or I don't even know if Eric's doing this specific video, but it's just a very common thing in this topic. It's like, hey, if you just give one or two good reasons to think that something like an Earth source is unlikely, that means it's impossible. But that obviously doesn't follow. Like, think about it, like a 5% chance of an Earth source being true is still a 5% chance. And what happens when we have, when we incorporate where Luke, he knows about Mark, and maybe that explains the undesigned coincidence, or maybe Luke made something up, or all these other things. There's 17 almost billion different possibilities out there, right? And maybe some of these are just really unlikely, like aliens, but some of them are also very likely. And maybe the highest is 5% chance other than eyewitness testimony. But if you have 20 of those, well, that's 100% chance, right? So I think that I think it would be wrong to just completely give a couple reasons why it's unlikely and say, okay, that's impossible, right? Last things, I know you want to say something, but Eric says if you look at eyewitness testimony for all of history and say there could be an original source that explains those two things. And yes, in every situation, that's obviously possibly, like, theoretically, that is possible. But that doesn't get you to never being able to conclude anything as eyewitness testimony. That would only apply if Dan assumes without evidence that everything goes to an original source. And maybe McClellan's doing that on some kind of subconscious level, as we talked about, but I don't think anyone is saying that there is, if there is an actual undesigned coincidence, that every single time it would have to be some previous source that they got it from, because obviously that's ridiculous. Rather, Dan is saying that undesigned coincidences are not anywhere close to showing a prior source is ruled out. Did you have anything to disagree with me? Prove that I'm wrong, Ben.
Who is it that says prove me wrong? Is it I forget. No. I don't really have anything to object to, but I do think this is illustrative of another problem with like the maximalist approach, is that a lot of these conversations require nuance and a reading of secondary literature. And this is something that, not universally, but very often, they just aren't interested or aren't willing to do the reading. Like even oral tradition. Oral tradition is complicated. There's a lot of theories about it. If anybody who's interested in the topic, Eric Eve wrote a book about oral tradition. It's really good. He's actually written a few books, Writing the Gospels, where he talks about how the Gospels were written and tools they use and sources and how it's... But his book on oral tradition goes through chapter by chapter various theories. And when you read this, you're like, wow, this is really complicated. Like, this is not... Like, we think of oral tradition and we think, oh, this is easy. Just, people talking. Well, it is people talking, but scholars have different ideas about how it works. And all of a sudden, you understand, oh, this requires a lot of nuance, and maybe I should read more. And sometimes, and maybe this is unjustifiable, but I feel this way, I just think Eric's not interested in the reading. I don't know, it just the inability to appreciate nuance is a hallmark of fundamentalism. And, if you're going to talk about these topics, you got to do the reading. If you want to talk about it with any kind of not necessarily authority, but at least with some ammo, you know?
Being justified in some way. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'll be honest, Eric has read a lot more Lydia McGrew than I have. Okay, so he knows. You know,
is true.
Some. You know, he is a Lydia McGrew expert, and there are a lot of other scholars that he knows a ton more than I do about. But at the same time, I do think, yeah, you do have to read a ton to really know this topic well. So yes.
You can just basically doubt any event in history. You could just doubt it, right? And this ends up being a history killer. And so this is what Lydia says. She says, since the hypothesis of an otherwise unknown Earth source just puts an unnecessary layer between the accounts we actually do have and the facts, it is not subject to principled limits. Hence, that type of method could be a history killer. Consider an event like the Battle of Gettysburg. Historians talk about things that happened there, like Pickett's charge on Cemetery Ridge, as real events. And they learn about various aspects of the battle from primary sources like military dispatches, speeches, putative eyewitness accounts, etc. Suppose we apply the source method to Gettysburg. Then we could just say that there's some account, which may or may not be true, that claims that the battle happened and that this and this and this happened during the battle, all of which details have become subsequently dispersed through other accounts, which aren't really eyewitness accounts either, but are just somehow copying bits and pieces of this entirely hypothetical source. This, of course, could be used to cast doubt on whether the Battle of Gettysburg ever happened at all. The more reasonable hypothesis is that there really was a Battle of Gettysburg at which various specific things like Pickett's charge actually happened, and that these have become known to us through these varied other accounts from people's knowledge of real events. Otherwise, we could never get to talking about the real world at all. Every source we do have is taken to be based on some other source or tradition that we don't have, and we can never get back to knowing the facts. This is a reductio of the method in question. So in other words, the source, it just inserts an imaginary middleman between our sources and reality. Once you do that, there's no principled limit to what you can explain away. Use it consistently, and you could doubt nearly any historical event at all with interlocking details.
So I know that he is, well, I think he's quoting from Lydia there. Can't remember exactly. But either way, I do think it's important to mention that I don't think he's necessarily, I know Dan is not the clearest, as I said before, but I don't think he's necessarily describing Dan's view as well. I don't think this addresses Dan's view, and the reason is because Eric acts like McClellan is commenting on all of eyewitness testimony, but McClellan's argument is specifically in regard to the undesigned coincidence argument. This whole Gettysburg thing is relevant because nobody is using undesigned coincidences, or practically nobody, to try and justify their historicity. So even if you apply these undesigned coincidences to Gettysburg, it still doesn't get you to undesigned coincidences, or should I say, eyewitness testimony. Other arguments get you there. I mean, maybe it is Dan's position, and if so, it's certainly worth mentioning. But I think maybe if we still blend him and just a little bit, that we can see it. I don't think it addresses it very well, or gets to the meat of what Dan's really saying.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add?
Only, well, so for his example from the Battle of Gettysburg, the analogy doesn't work on a number of levels, and I think anybody who'd read this would be, they're kind of obvious. Like, I've been to Gettysburg a number of times in my life. Like, we went there when I was a kid. Like, I think at least twice in the summer. I lived 6 hours away when I was a kid, and my parents took us there for vacation, and I just took my family there recently. And I love Gettysburg, but if you go to Gettysburg, you can see the signs of battle still there. If you go to the Jenny Wade house, for example, Jenny Wade was the only civilian killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. Only one. She was shot. I think she was about to cook something. Her pregnant sister was lying on her bed. I think she was pregnant, but she was sick. And she was shot. And you could see the bullet hole through the door where she was shot, like where it came through. I think there was a mortar blast that allowed the Wade family to escape to the neighboring house. It was two families in this house, and they were able to go through. Like, the signs of battle are everywhere, everywhere, and we have photographs of the aftermath. We have all this evidence for the battle. We have eyewitness testimony from people on opposing sides about the battle, but we don't have any of this for the Gospels. There's nobody who's writing a counter narrative to the Gospel of Mark saying, oh, this didn't really happen. We don't have any photographs of any healings anywhere, like, the deaf man, or, from Mark 7, or the blind man from Mark 8 that we, at Bethsaida. We don't have any of these. None of this evidence exists because this is the ancient world and it was not available. So when you approach ancient texts, you have to use different methodology. You have to look at it differently. So this analogy, she should have picked something better, because this one just doesn't work. Like, it's just not the same thing. I understand why she picked it, because the Battle of Gettysburg is super cool, but but it just does not work when it comes to what she's trying to say about this is a history killer. It just does not. It doesn't fly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you read Dan's a specific way, maybe it addresses like his specific argument, but I don't know how relevant it is to the overall discussion, I guess.
Well, I mean, have you read Dan's book?
The new one?
The Bible Says So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he talks about ancient history in there. Like, he talks about, because the ancient context is necessary to read ancient texts, right? Uh-huh. So he doesn't think that it's a history killer. So it's like Eric's kind of setting up or Lydia, they're setting up a straw man, basically. McClellan's not arguing this. He wouldn't argue this. Like you said, he's talking specifically about undesigned coincidences and what the data here warrants us to claim. But nobody, Dan's a trained scholar with a PhD. He knows his stuff. He's not stupid. I just kind of find it not offensive, but just kind of presumptuous. You know what I mean? Like Dan's written plenty of texts, including some monographs. He knows how to write history. He's read these texts. He knows what warrants, a conclusion and what doesn't. I don't know. Yeah,
obviously they're trying to do some kind of argument ad absurdum, or whatever that's called.
Yeah.
But I think there's definitely some truth to what you're saying in that. He's a scholar. Like, you might think he's biased. He's terrible. He's just the worst and a terrible human or something like that. Maybe you think that, okay, whatever. But there, at least in some way, he has some methodology, right? So I don't think you can say that his approaches to this or get you anywhere close to this history killer idea, unless if it's just, as I said before, some super unconscious bias thing that he's not explicitly saying, or maybe saying on an accident. I don't know.
Pieces of this entirely hypothetical source. This, of course, could be used to cast doubt on whether the Battle of Gettysburg ever happened at all. The more reasonable hypothesis is that there really was a Battle of Gettysburg, at which various specific things like Pickett's charge actually happened, and that these have become known to us through these varied other accounts from people's knowledge of real events. Otherwise, we could never get to talking about the real world at all. Every source we do have is taken to be based on some other source or tradition that we don't have, and we can never get back to knowing the facts. This is a reductio of the method in question. So, in other words, the source, it just inserts an imaginary middleman between our sources and reality. Once you do that, there's no principal limit to what you can explain away. Use it consistently, and you could doubt nearly any historical event at all with interlocking details. So this method is, it's not good, okay? So what about Dan's proposal of oral tradition? Remember, he said the biggest weakness of this idea, and the one that I'm going to keep going back to, is that this only demonstrates that there is a pre-existing source or two different versions of a narrative. It does not demonstrate that the pre-existing source is actual events in history that the people who created the narratives both witnessed. So it could be an oral tradition. Oral traditions famously have lots and lots of details, and lots of times people will draw one detail from the oral tradition for one telling, and somebody will draw another detail, and those could interlock in a way that indicates that they're both basing their story on a pre-existing narrative, whether that story is true or not. I don't think this works really well. And so, what does Dan use when he's responding to Wes? One example is the
Just a quick note here. So, Dad, a monk, became a YouTube member. Yay! And because he's got a Star Wars logo, wanted to show that. So that's pretty cool. My wife got me that. It's like from 1970, so it's like an antique. Pretty cool. It looks pretty freaky if you look at it too closely. So be careful there.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. And to everybody asking, I am supposedly a Greek philosopher of some kind. That's my cosplay for the day. But yeah, let's keep going here.
why Philip, right? And so Jesus turns to Philip and he says, "Hey, Philip, where are we going to buy bread so that these people can eat?" Well, we find out, this is John chapter 6, verse 4. We find out in John 1:44, a scattered text that has nothing to do with the feeding of the 5,000, that Philip was from Bethsaida, right? And then Luke puts it together and we throw in Luke's detail that the feeding of the 5,000 is in Bethsaida. Then it makes sense of why he asked Philip this question. He's a local. He could know where they could possibly get bread, right? To me, if we're going to say that this could be explained away through this oral source, it doesn't seem very plausible at all. I mean, are we going to really say that random?
Okay, just a real quick summary, just because I know that maybe there's a lot of people here that actually know what the undesigned coincidences are, but not everybody does, and it gets confusing. So just a really quick summary there for this section. So the things to remember: John 6 records Jesus asking Philip where bread can be bought to feed the crowd when trying to feed the 5,000. John 1:44 independently, in a different section, without narrative connection, says that Philip is from Bethsaida. Luke 9:10 independently notes that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred near Bethsaida. So they seem to all fit real nicely, and it seems like really interesting coincidence at the least. Yeah, none of these texts explicitly connect these facts. But yeah, let's keep going here.
Believers and say Antioch or Ephesus could just casually list the hometowns of Philip or any of the other 12.
Okay, so a lot to add there. What are your thoughts there?
So first of all, he says that, let me see the exact quote. He calls John 1:44 a scattered text, right? That has nothing to do with the feeding of the 5,000. I'm sorry, what? Like, why do we think that? Why do we think that this is a scattered text, whatever that means, that has nothing to do with the feeding? Like, it seems to me that he's implying or assuming that John is just kind of, he's like one of those authors. Sometimes I'm that way. You just kind of write and see where you're going. Like, you don't have a plan. You just kind of go at it. But I don't think that's how John writes. I think John's a planner. I'll give you a potential undesigned coincidence in the Gospel of John. So in John chapter 1, right, John the Baptist calls Jesus the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, right? Everybody knows that verse. It's pretty famous. Like, you know, it's a scattered, like, just a throwaway comment almost, right? But then, let me see if I can find it. In John chapter, where is it? I gotta find it.
Wow, you're doing this on the spot.
Yeah, it came.
He didn't have any notes for this. Yeah, he didn't have any notes for this, guys.
No. Where is it? Because it's just, there's the scene where he doesn't, he's pierced. Oh my gosh, come on, Ben. You're better than this. I don't spend a whole lot of time in the Gospel of John, as anybody can now tell, because, you know. Here we go. That's Barabbas. Where is it? it's the scene where the high priest brings him out, and
How about you can think about that. I've got some stuff to
yeah,
say.
yeah.
All
Go
right.
ahead. Go ahead.
A lot of stuff to say. The question to Philip makes more sense if the feeding happened near Philip's hometown. Yet no author draws that connection explicitly. That fit is said to be undesigned and therefore suggestive of historical memory rather than literary invention. But yeah, I was going to ask you what you thought about the framing so far, but you can go into that in a second. Did you find your source there?
No, but I don't need it. I'll find it later. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it. The idea that John just like John is interested in taking characters that aren't featured heavily in the synoptics and giving them speaking parts, right? Or identifying specific characters that are not anonymous but like not specified and giving them concrete names. He's also, by the way, he has no problem inventing disciples. Like, where is Nathaniel in any of the lists from Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Like, he's nowhere, but he's evidently a disciple. So it's not surprising to me at all that he has Philip. Why not have Philip? And why not at the beginning of your gospel say, oh, Philip was from Bethsaida, same thing as Peter and Andrew, which, by the way, the synoptics have Peter and Andrew from Capernaum, right? So I don't see why this is such an astonishing thing that Philip is from Bethsaida. And then that maybe the feeding is supposed to be, which is another issue we can talk about, is also in Bethsaida. Like, that doesn't, like, it doesn't surprise me. It just reads to me as an author planning out his story, right? I don't know. I'm trying to think why Eric finds that. I mean, maybe I don't need to do that because I don't need to psychologize. You know, I don't need to interrogate what his motives are or what his feelings are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have a confession. I was actually reading what I thought were my notes, but it was really just a summary of the argument. So it made no sense in the context of what I was saying. I am really curious. So Dan is, saying this whole oral source thing, and then Eric is responding like, hey, this oral thing doesn't work. But I'm just not really sure why Eric mentions this in regards to how an oral source just doesn't work. So oral traditions often preserve geographical, personal details, especially hometowns, key figures. The narrative could have circulated with Philip linked to Bethsaida without needing some independent authorial invention. None of the elements in these stories are rare. So Philip is a popular guy in John. He's mentioned a ton of times, like 12 times, I think. And John likes to give speaking roles to individual disciples. So it's just natural he's going to choose someone, right? Obviously. Philip is already one of the very small pool of named disciples. Philip is from Bethsaida, at least. Bethsaida is one of the most prominent towns in the Galilean Jesus tradition. So if this is the case that Philip was actually from Bethsaida or wherever this came from, naturally Bethsaida is going to be used at least somewhat often because it's just one of the most prominent towns. And then the feeding happens near Bethsaida. So the feeding has to happen somewhere in Galilee, right? So the story, at least, in my understanding, if it has to be somewhere around here, right, there's a high chance it's going to be Bethsaida. So there's plenty of opportunities for just a rare coincidence to occur, just because these are not just super rare details or anything like that.
Yeah, and really though, like, and we're just granting that. But if we dug into the details of that story in John 6, I mentioned this earlier, but I wrongly attributed it to Matthew. But if we look at the details in John chapter 6, the feeding could not have happened at Bethsaida. It just could not have. In the narrative, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and he sends them over to in a boat to go across to Capernaum. And then there's these people that come up. There's boats from Tiberias. Tiberias is south of Capernaum. Bethsaida is in the northeast along the Sea of Galilee. And then you come around the Sea of Galilee, and you have Capernaum, and then you have Tiberias. These boats come from Tiberias, and they go to the place where Jesus did the miracle. They don't like give a specific place. They just say they go to the place where he blessed the bread, is the phrase that they use. And they find out he's not in Capernaum, he's gone. Or he's not in that place, excuse me. He's not at the feeding place. So then they go to Capernaum where he is. So unless you're assuming they're going from Tiberias and crossing all the way over, all the way up to Bethsaida, and then going all the way back to Capernaum, unless you're assuming that, really the narrative just tells you they came from the south, they moved toward the north to where the feeding was, and then on to Capernaum. That's the way the narrative goes. It does not, at least is my reading of John's Gospel, the feeding could not have happened in Bethsaida. It would be a weird trip for those people to make. Not to mention the fact that it says it was everybody. They loaded everybody up, which is impossible. Just that could not have happened that way. So I think John's narrative itself rules out Bethsaida, as the location for the miracle, which then contradicts Luke, but is also somewhat in keeping with Mark, which I think John was definitely a reader of. And I think this is where he got this story, is primarily from Mark. But again, if you're only reading the text to find these eyewitness clues, you're missing out on the finer details that tell you more about the narrative, and that often end up saying, hey, this couldn't have been that way. But you got to be careful. You got to read the text. You got to really dig into it and read into it.
I see. So we have 1307.
Once you accept that, almost every small gospel detail random belief doesn't seem very plausible at all. I mean, are we going to really say that random believers in, say, Antioch or Ephesus could just casually list the hometowns of Philip or any of the other 12? Once you accept that, almost every small gospel detail becomes common knowledge very early on. That's not how information spreads in real communities. The simpler explanation is proximity to eyewitnesses, not a super informed oral network.
I know you have thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I don't know. What? So again, I can see where Eric is thinking, because he's thinking about this source, and he's reading it as one source for everything. But I don't know why that would be the case. Like it's pools of it's like different groups have different traditions, that are similar to one another. And so why couldn't it become common knowledge? Like, I don't see why. I just don't understand why that is the case. What I would like to see is Eric engaging with some secondary sources, experts on oral tradition or whatever, and making his case that way. Because when he talks like this, it's almost like he's an authority in and of himself. And I'm not an authority on this, and I know you're not an authority. We're not experts on this. So I have every reason to be skeptical of what Eric is saying. So I would really like to see more work being done to kind of see him connect the dots. Why couldn't they know more? Like you said earlier, you were talking about oral tradition often knows places and often knows people, even obscure places. And we have examples from history, like the works of Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Why wouldn't it be the case with oral tradition as it pertains to the Gospels? I need more. I would need Eric to make more of an effort to demonstrate that, to show why it couldn't be, because right now all he's doing is just kind of hand waving and dismissing it without doing any work to do it.
Yeah.
So
a lot of really interesting comments from Eric here. So I also have lots of questions. So I don't understand the relevance of asking if people in Antioch or Ephesus knew about Philip's hometown. Like, why specifically Antioch and Ephesus? Does he think that the texts were written there? Um, I mean,
Yeah.
does he think that everybody had to know in all of Christianity, or in every city, or lots of people had to know for this undesigned coincidence to happen? I don't really understand that. And what evidence is there to think that they couldn't list the hometown of Philip, or what someone told them was the hometown of Philip? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't see why not.
Exactly.
And why does it matter that if they knew any of the other 11 hometowns? Uh, what is the relevance here? And um, a tradition can be preserved by a small circle, teaching lineage, so which is just a very few people, written sources, a stable narrative introduction, like John 1. It does not require average believers everywhere knowing something. It requires Philip being associated with Bethsaida in one tradition, just one tradition. That's all you need. And Bethsaida appearing in feeding traditions elsewhere. That's it.
Yep.
And it is obvious that the places of Christian figures got made up. We see this all throughout history. It's absolutely crazy, all the crazy things that people assign with, the origins of where Peter lived and all this stuff with so little evidence of where. So yeah, I think that you can make a really strong case that this is the kind of thing that gets carried on in oral tradition, and or made up. So yeah, I really would like to know more. Where Eric is getting this data, or how you would even know. Like, obviously he doesn't have some kind of poll of, or what the, what is preserved in oral tradition. Like, if I'm going to, like, we have obvious examples of oral things that happen in oral tradition, right? But nobody's done some like poll of every single oral tradition. Like, this is what is preserved, this not. We can make some like psychological analysis of what people do and maybe do today, right? And I think that you can make some good arguments for what I'm saying from that perspective. But yeah, I'm really at a loss there for where Eric is coming from with that. Any questions before we keep going?
Nope. I'm with you.
Okay. And so these kind of details, like where a guy is from and what his name is, are the kind of details that tend to kind of drop out over the passing of it being told, right? And so this is Michael Bird. He says that I regard the evidence surveyed as constituting moderate grounds for identifying a conserving force in the transmission of Jesus tradition, since the gaps in our knowledge are too vast to assert otherwise. At the end of the day, most of what is said about the formation of Jesus tradition is based on a priori assumptions, circumstantial evidence, inference, hypothesis, analogy, conjecture, and sheer guesswork. And so here, a conserving force can hardly mean that everyone knew what city Philip was from already, way before John mentioned it. This just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, we could...
Before we get too far, I did want to comment one. So Eric earlier said, so these kinds of details, like where a guy's from and what his names are the kind of details that tend to drop out over the passing of it being told. But I don't see how that's true either. So names and places are some of the most stable things that stay in a oral or written tradition, and they're easily fabricated. So I mean, in this time period, they didn't have last names, right? So I don't know what your last name is, Ben, but everybody just pretend it's Samson. So yeah, they didn't have a Samson on the last name, right? You have Jesus of Nazareth, Mary Magdalene, from Magdala, supposedly, Joseph of Arimathea, Simon of Cyrene, Paul of Tarsus, so on. It's a long list, and that is obviously very associated with your name. That's kind of what you hear. That's how you think of them. Oh, he lives over there across the sea, right? And people remember these places better than abstract ideas, or because our city was founded by an apostle. It's kind of like a thing of pride, and people don't like ambiguity, so sometimes people just make up stuff. If someone's origin is unknown, a plausible one just gets attached. All you need is some guy to say, "Hey, John, or Paul, do you?" I'm using biblical names, which makes it a terrible example. Here you go, Dylan. Do you remember where Paul was from? Dylan's like, I can't. I don't know. Tarshish, maybe. Maybe. Oh, and then the other guy's like, well, I want to be convincing for my audience, so it's Paul of Tarshish, obviously, right? Not that that's actually what happened. Maybe we can be more confident about that one. But it is so easy for things to just get made up when you have oral tradition, and especially in a culture where they're not as history based like we have today.
Yep.
All right.
Block Dan's second line of defense when he tries to do the divide and conquer approach. What Dan tries to say in one of his responses to, I believe, Jonathan McClatchy is Philip's a big character. He's mentioned a bunch in John. But outside of John 6, Philip speaks a grand total of twice and is briefly mentioned once talking to some Greeks. He's not a major figure driving the narrative, even if John does mention him more than the synoptics. Peter and Andrew also being from Bethsaida, which he mentions, he's like, well, Andrew's from Bethsaida too. And Peter, that actually strengthens the case because it would make perfect sense how Andrew would have known about the boy with the loaves. He could have just been acquainted with the kid, right? And so now let's look at another example of an undesigned coincidence and see how this whole oral theory just doesn't really play very well, right? And so in Matthew 14, 1-2, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him.
Did you have something you want to say before that section? I think you did. Yeah.
Well,
right.
so he quotes Michael Bird, and so I just want to add something Bird says in that same chapter to which Manning appeals.
Yeah.
He says this: "We will never arrive at a foolproof theory of how the Jesus tradition was handled and developed into the canonical Gospels, but the exercise remains necessary as a prolegomena to historical Jesus research." And Bird in that chapter also talks about the way these traditions, the way the Gospels, like these stories, were conserved, right? It's not just individuals, it's communities. And, I mean, in some way, I think that's kind of arguing against Manning's point. This might be an example of quote mining. But, like, why couldn't, like you said, why couldn't a community preserve the place someone was from? Or, like why are these details, why does oral tradition preclude the idea of that kind of preservation? I don't, like you said, I don't see any reason to think that. So I think Bird kind of, I don't think Eric would agree with everything Michael Bird has to say. I don't know where he got this quote. I don't know if he's read this book or what, but yeah, I think there's problems there.
Yeah. You got to shout out Ben. Oh my God, it's Ben, says Kip.
Hey, Kip.
Zach knows all the coolest people. See, he didn't say that about me. He didn't say I was like one of the cool. He just says specifically Zach knows the coolest people. So.
Well, and Kip's a notorious liar, so you can't believe anything he says.
That's awkward. That's really awkward there. Yeah. So there's something else I think you mentioned that was helpful. You say that it is absolutely true that Philip isn't driving the narrative, but John has a penchant for taking characters from the synoptics that have minimal roles, if any at all, and giving them speaking parts in his account. So Philip is a prime example of this, as is Thomas. Interestingly, John often takes unnamed characters in various stories and identifies them as it were. It is Peter who lobs off Malchus's ear in John 18:10, not unnamed characters in the synoptics. It is Thomas who doubts in John 20, not a generic group in Matthew 28 and Luke 24. And it is Philip and Andrew specifically who are given parts in the feeding narratives, not unnamed disciples as in the synoptics. Interestingly, John changes the story such that it is not the disciples, but the boy. Did you have anything to add to your already thought?
Only to say that some of that I got from Mark Goodacre's recent book on John as the fourth synoptic gospel, which, if you've not read it, get it and read it. It's phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal.
Or you can watch a video if you like his voice.
Doesn't play very well, right? And so in Matthew 14, 1-2, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So how exactly would we know what Herod said to his servants, right? This is in the privacy of his own home. Well, we get the answer supplied from a scattered text found in Luke. Luke 8:3 talks about some of Jesus's female followers, one of them being Joanna, who happens to be the wife of Huzzah, Herod's household manager. So Jesus's followers had family in the highest ranks of Herod's servants. Why is this a problem for Dan? Well, on Dan's source view, the source would have to contain both stories, but oral traditions usually preserve single episodes, not all these cross-story connections. And if the details came from different traditions, the coincidence still remains. Therefore, the whole source move doesn't actually solve the problem at all.
All righty. What'd you think about that? What'd you have to add?
Okay, so first of all, why are we assuming that Herod is telling anybody anything only in the privacy of his own home?
That's a good question.
Like, what sort of anachronistic 21st century... I mean, not even that, because people talk in public all the time. So, I thought that was funny.
Well, not everybody. Okay. Not everybody.
Well, that's true. That is true. You're very right about that. So I thought that was really just a weird throwaway. I don't think Eric thought that through. Maybe he would like retract that given the chance. But so let's talk about Matthew and Herod, right? So Eric he quotes Herod in Matthew, right? He says, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. Now remember, people are talking about who Jesus is, right? The focus is on Jesus. Is he Elijah? Is he a prophet? Is he John raised from the dead? Well, Herod's convinced. He believes that it is is John the Baptist raised from the dead. And he's, that's not good news for him. Why would it matter? So if Matthew has a source in Herod's entourage, as it were, then we have a huge problem, because that same source is presumably behind Luke, right? Because after all, Eric is getting this source from Luke's gospel. When Luke tells the story, well, he doesn't exactly tell the story of John's death the same way. But when he tells it in, where's my notes? Luke chapter 9.
7 to 9.
Is that what it is? 7 through 9? Yeah. So when Luke tells it, it says that he was perplexed. Herod was perplexed because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the ancient prophets had arisen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he tried to see him. So immediately you have a glaring contradiction between what Luke records from his eyewitness and from, on Eric's view, what Matthew records from presumably the same eyewitness, if it's this person who's in the upper echelon of Herod's entourage. Who's right? Is it Herod believing that John the Baptist is raised from the dead, or is it John saying, or Herod saying, "Oh, I killed John. It's obviously some other guy. I'd like to see him." And consonant with the narrative in Luke, when Jesus is arrested, he is taken before Herod, and Herod basically says, "Oh, you're the one that I wanted to see," right? Like Luke's narrative is consistent on this matter. But not so much. But on Eric's view, you have this huge problem. Either someone is misremembering what the eyewitness said, or one of the authors is right, one of the authors is wrong, or they're both wrong. Like, there's so many problems that attend to the issue of whether this is eyewitness testimony. It's almost like by throwing in this eyewitness testimony that Eric has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into the entire edifice he's building on gospel reliability. So, I mean, but again, this is why you read the text. This is why you get into the details of the narrative. You pay attention to what you're reading. It's a lesson.
Yeah. All right, so this is a super long session. I might fall asleep during this one.
Furthermore, this is another example that I think is just completely devastating to Dan's
Not because it's boring or anything against Eric. It's a long one.
Yeah.
proposal. In John chapter 12, 1 through 2, and then 12 through 13, we read about 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. And then it says the next day in chapter 12, the crowd took palm branches, and then there's the whole triumphal entry scene, right? Well, in Mark 11, 1 through 11, Jesus nears Bethphage and Bethany, sends for the colt, enters Jerusalem, visits the temple, and then returns to Bethany that night. And so John timestamps this particular event, and then Mark describes it. We get the same sequence, the arrival in Bethany, and then the next day, the triumphal entry and the return to Bethany. Now, there's this whole countdown that we see in Mark's gospel. In Mark 11, 12 through 14, we read that on the following day, and then Jesus goes on to curse the fig tree, and then he enters the temple, drives out the money changers, and then in the evening, it says that he went out of the city, right? And so this is all derived from Mark chapter 11. So that fits as 4 days before Passover in John's framework. Now, in day 3, we see Mark 11:20, it says, as they passed by in the morning, so there had to be another day, they saw the fig tree withered to its roots. And then in Mark 11:27 through 12:44, there's the teachings and debate in the temple throughout the day. And then we get the whole Olivet discourse in Mark chapter 13. And then chapter 14, we read, it was now 2 days before the Passover. The discourse likely occurred at sunset en route to Bethany, which cross-reference that with John chapter 12, right? And so John gives explicit timestamps. This is what I want you to get here. He gives explicit timestamps, 6 and 5 days before Passover, as just this throwaway extraneous detail. Mark gives the implicit sequence, day by day progress. The reason why this is a nightmare for Dan is that think about this from an oral tradition framework. That would typically preserve individual episodes, not precise multi-day timelines. Mark narrates several consecutive days with morning and evening markers. John independently supplies a specific starting date, 6 days before Passover. Mark never even states the date, yet his sequence lands exactly where John's date predicts. An oral source would flatten or repeat the timestamp. It wouldn't leave it implicit across days. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And if Dan wants to do, again, the divide and conquer route and say that John is just carefully counting Mark's days, Mark's timeline is very implicit. It's not at all labeled. The days would have to be reconstructed from him basically gathering all these scattered clues that we did right now. So that would require John to infer an unstated starting point, count multiple days across episodes, back calculate to the Passover date. There's no sign of John doing that kind of meticulous bookkeeping, right? It's far simpler to just say that John remembered the date and Mark remembered the sequence, right? Doesn't that make more sense to you?
Doesn't that make more sense to you, Ben?
Oh, why? Why? If we can construct a timeline by reading Mark, why couldn't John do that? Was John an idiot? Like it makes no sense to me to say, well, John's not doing that kind of timekeeping. It's an implicit chronology in Mark. It may be implicit, but it's not as if we can't tease out the details and figure it out. Like we know when Good Friday is, we know when the resurrection is. It wouldn't be difficult for anybody to figure out a basic timetable. Why couldn't John have done that reading Mark? And that's another issue. Eric is so heavily invested in attacking Dan on the oral tradition aspect that he's ignored the fact that Dan also mentioned literary tradition. Right? We have literary tradition to deal with, not just an oral source. And if Mark is a source for John, which I think he likely is, then John is a reader of Mark and he can take these details. Moreover, John is interested in timekeeping anyways. He does this at the beginning of his gospel. He traces time from the beginning of the first disciples with Jesus when he's with John the Baptist, and then he does it for a number of days. It's fitting then that this is almost like an inclusio for the gospel, where he begins with counting time and he ends with counting time. So I just this reading of John that treats John as some kind of inferior, like he couldn't possibly have read Mark and derived the sequence. It's just so snobbish. It's just so, I don't know, condescending. And then to ignore the fact that John has this interest, especially at the beginning of his gospel, and couple that with the fact that early Christians were very interested in the passion narrative, like what happened to Jesus. So I think that there would have been multiple versions of the story that had, very similar central details. So that even if it wasn't a literary source, and Dan's view on oral sources, I just don't see why that still couldn't work. I don't know. I think this is a poor reading of the Gospel of John on Eric's part.
Yeah, so just from the audience perspective, because it's hard to follow sometimes. So what the argument is, okay, so John explicitly dates Jesus' arrival in Bethany as 6 days before Passover, and then narrates the triumphal entry the next day. So it lists the first 2 days. Mark does not give dates, but narrates a sequence of days using phrases like on the following day, in the morning, in the evening, 2 days before Passover. When you reconstruct Mark's sequence, it lines up perfectly with John's explicit dates. Therefore, Mark must remember the sequence, or John remembers the date. The fit is undesigned. So Eric says, think about this from an oral tradition framework that would typically preserve individual episodes, not precise multi-day timelines. But I don't know exactly if that's true. So John is 6 days before Passover, but I don't think that is a throwaway detail. So 6 days before Passover, some scholars argued that it functioned to frame Jesus's death typologically, because it echoes creation week symbolism. So you mentioned the dates, the beginning of John, but of course in John 1 it's got all kinds of creation language. It's set, and then so what this does from a thematic perspective is it sets up this climactic 6th day idea, this theme. So it's not just some, like, I don't know, record keeping or something like that. And I do think that it is not correct that oral tradition can that it just cannot preserve relative sequences across a few days. So especially if the events are clustered, that you like it's just, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe another good way to put it, but especially if they're clustered, they culminate in a major festival. So like everybody's gonna remember, okay, this is the major thing. The sequence itself is meaningful because it has the arrival, and then there's a confrontation, there's an arrest. So of course people can remember that, right? Yeah. And Mark never says this was 4 days before Passover, or this happened 5 days before Passover. The day count only emerges after you assume which events happen on the same day, when evening transitions to a new day, how Jewish day reckoning is being applied, that Mark's 2 days before Passover anchors backward cleanly. So I don't know. You maybe that's the correct view. I would have to look more, but I could see a number of things that maybe aren't so clean with that. In other words, the alignment only exists if we are constructing it that way. So maybe there's not an actual good way to construct that. And also Mark's timeline is sequential, but it's not precise. So Mark's markers function to create narrative momentum, structure episodes, highlight symbolic acts like a fig tree and temple. And this is widely recognized in Markan scholarship. The fig tree is literally intercalated with the temple cleansing. The day structure serves theology, not chronologies. In other words, the mention in these, it's not just some like historical account or something like that. So I don't know if we should necessarily assume that's the case, although I don't know if that specifically addresses the argument that he's making. Maybe it does, or maybe not. Any thoughts on that before we keep going?
Well, like the intercalated story of the fig tree, right? Mark loves these intercalated tales, sandwich stories, right? They're all over the place. The story of the healing of Jairus' daughter has the Jairus coming and telling my daughter's sick, and then you have the woman with the hemorrhage in between, and then you have the end of the other side of the sandwich is the healing of the sick, the dead child at that point. So Mark likes these kind of stories. And they have theological import, and Mark likes this kind of stuff. So this fig tree has a very specific function. It's a way to say, judgment's coming, etc. So Yeah, which, but does John have the fig tree? I can't remember. Does he do that? I don't think he does. That might be just Mark. But yeah. Yeah, in any event.
Yeah.
So
All right.
let me ask you. So
Yeah.
Mark has this implicit sequence.
Mhm.
And I just want to push back against something
Go for
and
it.
see what you think. So there is an element of like kind of like rushing and trying to get to the crucifixion, but as one scholar famously said, the Gospels are passion narratives with extended introductions. The passion narrative, at least in Mark, seems to slow things down a little bit. Almost like he's trying to build not suspense, but like he's trying to emphasize the importance of what's about to happen. Like I don't sense the same, and maybe you do when you read it. I don't sense the same urgency when I read the passion narrative of Mark, as maybe I do other parts of a story. I think he's slowing down. I don't know. Do you have any thought? I mean, this is not directly related to undesigned coincidences, but
yeah.
I just because I know you've probably read the passion narratives a dozen times,
At least once.
at least. But what do you think about Mark slowing down?
No, that's good. Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily to speed up now that you mention it, but there's certainly like I don't know. I think that when you include like days in a text, it has some type of different feel to it. Maybe it's slowing down or like building momentum, but there's like this is it. Like it's day 6, day 5, right? So yeah. No, I'd have to think about that a little more.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the question, and yeah, it was John 1:48. 51 does have the fig tree. All right.
Oh. Okay.
Did you have anything to comment on that? If that's
No.
Okay.
That's what I needed to know.
Okay. That's it. That's all, folks. That's all we needed to know. All right. So, yeah, I don't even know where I'm at. Near the end of this video, I just my notes are all over the place. So, yeah, good luck. We're probably missing half the video.
The scholar that Dan is quoting here, the Earth source theory, it's just hopeless, right? As an oral theory, it fails. Oral traditions preserve stories, not hidden structures, cross-episode links, or latent timelines. As a textual theory, it fails. Copying doesn't explain fragmented details that only cohere across independent accounts. It has no limits. Any interlocking evidence can be dismissed because you could just invent a lost Earth source that just explains it all away. And you could say, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. It's just this shared narrative. One person took this part, another took this part, and they interlock. We don't even know if it's true. If this is the move that Dan says he's going to keep coming back to, as he said in the video, then the problem isn't the data. It's the method, right? It's Alter's method that Dan is just like imbibing and regurgitating on his video here. Now,
I like the word imbibing.
divide and conquer approach that he does take in some of his other videos is way more fruitful here. I think that would at least engage the evidence, and he does try to do there. But even there, the execution usually falls apart. I'll give a quick example of that, and we'll finish up here. So he notes that Dale Allison, in reference to Mark chapter 6, with the feeding of the 5,000, it talks about the people are described as being sheep without a shepherd, and then Jesus tells the people to sit on the green grass, and that the people eat and are satisfied, and that there is water. The Sea of Galilee is nearby, and concludes that the passage is a riff off of Psalm 23. And so what we have, the example to be a little more clear here, is that Mark talks about green grass and crowds of many people coming and going, where in John chapter 6, verse 4, John provides a missing detail, that it was Passover, which would explain why the grass was green, because it was the rainy season, and grass is typically green around that time, Passover, right? And so what Dan does is goes, well, I mean, there's got to be an explanation. He can't just say that the grass is green, can he? And so he's obviously riffing off of Psalm 23. This is just what scholarship tells us. Come on, guys, don't you get it? Well, here's why we have a whole problem with scholarship to begin with is they suffer from a disease called hermeneutical pareidolia. To quote my friend Tim McGrew, who is married to Lydia, who wrote the book on undesigned coincidences, he says that on the other hand, the grass is not called a pasture. The people are not in the presence of their enemies. The Sea of Galilee is not still water. No one's head is being anointed with oil. No cups are in evidence. The psalm doesn't mention any leftovers. So what sort of writer are we imagining the evangelist to be? One who makes up entire scenes with a view to making subtle, indirect allusions to the 23rd Psalm?
What do you think there?
Okay, so there's a few things. First of all, the grass is not called a pasture. Like, what does that have to do with anything? Like, what is green? What is a pasture, if not grass? Like, well, I don't understand, like, how you missed that connection. It makes the mistake of saying that in order for the illusion to work, all the elements of the text from which they are drawing have to be present. But that's not how illusions work, right? So take, for example, Matthew the beginning of Matthew, right? He tells this story about Jesus' birth and going to Egypt. There are Moses motifs everywhere. Virtually every scholar, evangelical, acknowledges that Matthew is using this motif. Now, evangelical scholars won't say it didn't happen, they'll just say Matthew's using this kind of style. But it's all over the place. But not every element of the Moses story is present. Like it doesn't have to be. That's not how authors work. That's not how they work today. Like if you find an Easter egg in a movie, for example, I just watched the latest version of The Running Man with Ryan Gosling, right?
Okay.
And if you know the previous movie, you'll see some Easter eggs. Like there's an image. I think it's on a currency, one of those new dollars, whatever they call them. And who's on the dollar? But Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, why would Arnold Schwarzenegger be on that dollar? Because he was in the original Running Man movie. But I don't need to have every single element from the original movie to be in this one to understand the illusion. I just know the illusion's there because there's elements they're picking out. And I think Mark does that, obviously. Partially with Psalm 23, but also with other texts, like from the Deuteronomistic history, like from, I think, 2 Kings. He does this with Jesus stilling the storm. He borrows language and themes and motifs from the book of Jonah. But I don't need every element from Jesus doesn't get swallowed by a whale.
That you know of.
Well, that's true. That is true. But I don't need all these little details to know, oh, yes, he is alluding to the story of Jonah. I mean, I just, this idea that you have to have every single detail from the alluded story in the current one makes no sense. Nobody believes that about anything, and it's just a ridiculous straw man, is what it is. That's not how illusions work.
Yeah. I did want to comment on the whole. You were kind of saying this earlier about there's kind of this, just like, I don't know, really negative outlook on scholarship, I guess.
Yeah.
And the reason I want to comment on it is that, just from a public speaking perspective, we're influencers, even if we have only like 15 subscribers. And Eric has a lot more, to be fair. So when someone like Eric says, hey, all these scholars are just making all these mistakes, and he doesn't just say just some scholars, he says scholars. What are the exact words? I can't remember. It was like, let me see here if I can find it.
Yeah, here's why we have a whole problem with scholarship to begin with.
Right. A whole with scholarship to begin with. So it's everything. Even though he is a big fan of some scholars, right? As you were saying before. But what this does to a group of people, a huge group of people that are very fundamentalist and just hate the idea of scholarship, is that means they don't read any of them. They take that as an excuse that, hey, Eric's saying, and he's making a good point, that these two pareidolia, I should just ignore all of them. And that's not really helpful for this conversation if we're trying to look for truth. And what that also means is anytime Dan McClellan says anything at all, people are going to discount it because of claims like this. It's, or like when you misrepresent Bart Ehrman, which happens all the time that I've seen online, at least. It's just like, Bart Ehrman, he's just such an idiot. And it's like, well, all scholars must be like him, right? And that's not what Eric said, but that's how people take it. And I think that maybe there's better ways to frame things that are more helpful.
So a couple of years ago, Robert Clifton Robinson, who's this apologist, wrote this blog post about how we don't need scholarship, we just read the Bible for ourselves. So I wrote this response post, and my whole point of the post was, unless you have in front of you the manuscripts themselves. If you're reading Greek, you're probably reading it in an eclectic edition. You're probably reading it in an edited edition that was done by scholars. If you can't read Greek and you can only read it in English, then you're necessarily relying on scholars who have training in the languages to relay this into something you can understand. They decry scholarship, but they are entirely dependent upon it to read the text they want to prove is true. So this idea that scholars are categorically wrong or should be summarily dismissed just completely undercuts the very thing they're trying to do. Like, you don't have a Bible without scholars. You don't have it. You rely on scholarship. You just don't think you do.
Yeah, definitely something for people to remember in this type of camp. Not necessarily that Eric doesn't agree with you there, but yeah. So I don't have a ton of thoughts otherwise to add about the video. Let's see here. Did you have anything else you wanted to add about this section here?
No, I didn't really think. I don't think I have very many notes on that.
Okay, gotcha. Alrighty. Oh, your comments were helpful because you kind of summarized what Allison was saying. So let me see if I can find that.
Oh yeah.
Where's it at? Gosh darn it. That's so awkward. I will.
Yeah. I think Eric even cites it exactly, like where you can find it. I think you can find it on Dale Ellison's academia.edu page. You can find the article for free. But Ellison's argument is just that, like he notes the fact that John says that the feeding happened in Passover, and so potentially that explains the green grass. But Ellison then says basically, well, we have this other. We know these authors use these texts, the ancient Jewish scriptures. So why not just look to them? Why not start there and see what we can go with? We don't have to say, well, John says it's from Passover, so it must be some kind of memory from it being at Passover. It could just be that the author of Mark, who obviously was a reader of the Bible, wanted to use these motifs, and I think it's a much more cogent explanation than that Mark, who is relying on Peter, notes the green grass but not the timing. Why wouldn't his source have told that? But again, Eric obviously disagrees with that view. Hermeneutical pareidolia. So
awesome. All right. Right. So thank you much for everybody watching. Thank you, Ben, for coming on. Any last thoughts that you want to add that you missed out on or something?
No. I think this was. I think you had a lot of good things to say about this that really kind of call into question specifically the methodology and some of the assumptions. I think you and I can both agree that Eric, and let me say this. Eric and I have our differences, but Eric is really good at writing and framing an argument, like a flow of thought.
Yeah.
He is just super. There's very few apologists that I know of that can do it like he does. He is just really, really good at it. He's good at summarizing. I have issues with some of his. I think they're quote mining, but we can disagree on that. But for what it's worth, Eric is very good at that. So I'm a little jealous of his ability to do that. But to your point,
slides though, pretty nice.
Yeah, like who? How is that not memorable? Like, it's just he's really good at that. It makes me sick. But to your point, I think he would do well to maybe connect the dots more on oral tradition and what it can and cannot do, because I think there's some scholarship out there, and I hate to use that word because he doesn't like it, out there that might bolster his, or hopefully change it. But again, I think you raised some interesting and important points on this.
Thanks. Hopefully I'll get into a blog post or something one day on yours. Yeah, but everybody go like and subscribe for Ben's Amateur Exegete channel, and a lot of interesting videos. I cited from him in my Enoch video, where he talked about Enoch and if Jude thought it was inspired. So really interesting video there. Thanks for watching, guys. This might be my longest video. I'm not sure. This was not 4 hours, but yep. If you didn't like this one, that's okay. The next one will be better. Thanks you guys for coming on. And as I said before, go check out Ben's stuff. Thank you guys.